Thank you, Hala. I am indeed delighted to be here, and particularly this podium today, with three rising young scholars looking at a wide diversity of Arctic affairs. I'm going to go through my presentation fairly quickly because some of it's been covered in other sessions. But broadly, I'm going to talk about an overview of the resource developments in the Arctic, the impact on Arctic peoples, broader environmental challenges, the emergence of new maritime sea routes, and all of these, of course, will have an impact on climate change. We all know that the Arctic sea ice is retreating, making the region open for longer for oil and gas extraction, although obviously with Shell's decision to withdraw from the Arctic just a few days ago, it may be a while with current low oil prices before renewed interest in the Arctic takes place. We know the polar ice cap is melting. We know Arctic summer sea ice, which covers half the area, did in 2000. But I think the broader question we might want to ask ourselves with new maritime sea routes, which I'll get to in just very quickly, do we want new maritime sea routes in the Arctic? It all sounds glamorous. People will tell you that it will be a cheaper mode of transport, but how much Arctic maritime traffic can the region actually sustain? We get all excited when the numbers go 30, 40, 50, and next year it doubles. But what if we were talking about the number of maritime traffic through the Arctic that we see through the Suez Canal when we're talking about literally 15 to 18,000 transits? And what would the implications be on that? We all know that there is a lot of oil. We believe there's a lot of oil and gas in the Arctic. This slide just very dramatically shows that, of course, we believe the overwhelming amount of resources are in Russia, particularly in the natural gas area, but also significant oil resources. We know that there's been activity in the Arctic since the 1960s when Russia and Siberia and the United States at Prudhoe Bay began to make the first discoveries that have now led to quite significant production in both some of the Arctic regions of Russia as well as in Alaska. We do have, I know some people will dispute this and have at this conference, but I do believe if you look at the reality that there have been tremendous advances in Arctic drilling technology, not without setbacks as well. But I think the oil industry, if we were to see prices go back to $90 or $100, would still be interested in the Arctic, because the reality is that when they look at where the projected oil that the world is going to need over the next 20 years is located, the areas where it's believed to exist in the 12 to 13 million barrels a day of additional production that is forecast to be needed, unfortunately, that oil overwhelmingly lies in Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Orinoco regions of Venezuela, the Canadian tar sands, all fairly areas that are either technologically complex or politically risky. And the reality is when you talk to most people in the international oil industry, they believe we can handle the technological risk of drilling in the Arctic better than we can handle the political risks of dealing in volatile regions of the world. So they remain very optimistic that in the long run, the Arctic oil will be needed. And keep in mind that not only in the next 20 years are we going to add about another 1.6 billion people to the planet. We already have 1.2 billion people in the world that have no access to commercial energy, not a single light bulb. We have another 1 billion people or more that are using biomass as a primary fuel, not only with attendant health risks to themselves, but also, of course, deleterious impacts on both local emissions and on climate change. Gas is obviously a resource of great interest in the Arctic. We heard a presentation from a Russian representative on the Yamal Peninsula gas. Unfortunately, I think the people that are counting on liquefied natural gas in the near term serving as a bridge to the era of renewables across the planet may be in for a rude shock. Because the reality is that even with existing LNG shipments in the world has a surplus of LNG. Spot prices in Asia are now down under $6 a million BTU when they were $18 to $20 just a few years ago. At that price, it is physically impossible, financially impossible for LNG from the United States to find markets in Asia. So my colleagues and I at Brookings and many other observers of the gas market are beginning to question whether there won't be even a larger surplus as many plants currently under construction hit, and whether the collapse of the world LNG market will be a very significant event that I think people better begin to pay attention to. Minerals, I won't bother going over this, but the Arctic is rich in minerals, particularly the Canadian Arctic. There's great hope for some mineral development in Greenland, of rare earths in particular. Now, I know we have people in this room, and we had presentations that would probably say we should never develop these minerals. But this is one of the critical questions I think this conference has to walk away with, is to what extent are we prepared to leave the Arctic undeveloped? Maybe we have to leave the Arctic undeveloped, but if we do leave the Arctic undeveloped, let's remember what that means for a better quality of life, at least financially speaking, for the inhabitants of the Arctic. Not only the 4 million people roughly that live in the Arctic worldwide, but the 10% of that number, more or less, of the native populations who, whatever one thinks about the wisdom of drilling for oil and gas in the Arctic, I think it's hard to dispute the fact that a lot of the native communities where energy resource has occurred are substantially better off today with better medical care, better opportunities for their children for education, better paying jobs, etc. Although clearly there are some in the native community who have been opposed to oil and gas and mineral development and will continue to do so. There are over 221 marine species in the Arctic, including a wide variety of fish. The reality is, in the Arctic Ocean itself, we really don't know what inventories of fish there are. And of course, this is even more important to put some very tough regulations in effect before massive fishing commences in the Arctic Ocean, so that we at least have an idea of what is there and to regulate it on a sustainable basis as rapidly as possible. But we do know that as a result of climate change, that species are moving north as it warms, and that this is changing. In Alaska, you have native villagers on the west coast, northwest coast of Alaska, telling you that they're catching fish they've never seen before, and not catching fish that are the traditional staple of their local communities. We have, of course, major populations of whales and walruses, and these too are shifting as a result of climate change. The changing in fish migration patterns in particular are having, it appears, beginning to have a devastating impact on the walrus population, which no longer has access in some localities to the fish the walrus traditionally feasts upon. Recently, the United States, Russia, Canada, Norway, and Denmark signed an accord to prevent unregulated commercial fishing in the high seas of the Arctic Ocean. This, I think, is a very important event, although unfortunately Iceland was excluded from the talks when clearly, as were Finland and Sweden, when clearly all these people have a seat at the table and need to have a seat at the table. And we also have, obviously, we've heard countries such as China, Spain, Japan, the United Kingdom, Singapore, Korea, that also have great interest in the fisheries of the Arctic. Arctic peoples, I've talked about over 40 different ethnic groups. It's easy to lump these people together. In reality, they are very, very different from one country to another of the indigenous peoples. Some are much more integrated into the local societies than others, and those that are truly subsistence hunters and gatherers need to have their rights respected. But on the other hand, keep in mind that 400,000 people, why they need their rights respected, what about the 1.2 billion people that have no access to energy elsewhere in the world? Is it really morally just to say we don't do something in the Arctic when these people in the lower climes need access to energy to protect the much smaller population? I don't come down on that one way or the other, but I think it's a very profound philosophical question that people need to begin to ask. We've heard a lot about the permafrost, but recently, just in the last week or so, we've begun to hear how melting permafrost is also beginning to unleash bugs that are eating more of the permafrost, suggesting that the acceleration of the melting of the permafrost may be upon us very, very quickly. And once released, I think Dr. Mumas gave us some very compelling numbers on how fast the permafrost melt could accentuate what otherwise might be a slower pace of climate change. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go finally to the sea route question. We know that the northern sea route, in particular across the top of Russia, is an area that we definitely need to watch. We need to have search and rescue capability, and I personally think some of the buildups that the Russians are doing that has been criticized in Washington may be overblown, that they're actually building a network of stations that will be necessary if we're going to see more commercial activity in the region. And finally, let me just ask a few more questions that I think a lot of panels have touched upon but not answered. Do we need the energy resources of the Arctic or not? Can we reconcile having vast marine protected areas and resource development, or does one preclude the other? What volumes of maritime traffic can the Arctic actually sustain? What about the militarization of the Arctic? It's easy to dismiss it, but when the new Russian ambassador talks about the Arctic being Russia's new Mecca, one has to step back and at least question what the devil he means by that. And finally, we have to deal with the question of how we deal with renewable energy in the Arctic versus commercial energy. Thank you very much.